Thank you for the invitation that I received here, and welcome everyone here in Konstanz, but also at the partner universities of the University of Konstanz. What I will summarize today is research that has happened, that is taking part largely within the cluster of excellence, the politics of inequality. We are moving towards the second phase of funding. A group of us was last week in Bonn, and they came back that and believe that the reapplication might get funded. So this is a big event for you, and I'm a PI at this cluster and examine within the cluster here administrative inequality, administrative discrimination. Okay, now it's hanging. So I will move to the next slide as soon as this technical glimpses. Okay. Yeah, so the motivation for the research projects that I'm undertaking here is largely based on an article that I published with a student in the March of 2017. And this was based on a talk, a very similar talk I gave to the students here at the University of Konstanz. And then Lisa Riedel, this is the name of this student, came up to me whether I would have an interesting topic for her for conducting her master study. And I asked her, do you want to look at recognition rates, protection rates for refugees in Germany? And what she then assembled was a data set that exhibited large differences between the German states. As you might know, there are 16 German states, and the discrepancy, as you see here on this figure, have then increased when the influx of refugees started to accelerate during the so-called refugee crisis. So we published this article, and on the day the article was published, there was also a press release, and this created a considerable media storm, as I've never experienced such a reaction in all my life as an academic. It led to several interventions in the Bundestag. It was also the basis for an official inquiry whether in the responsible agency everything went well, what it didn't. And I continued to work on this topic then. But it dates back to much earlier study that I conducted when I or started to conduct when I was still a postdoc in Switzerland and assistant professor at the University of Bern, where we also discovered huge discrepancies across German states from the 1980s and 1990s, but especially across the Swiss cantons. And we talked here about discrimination, as we did in the later articles, and obviously decision makers did not particularly like that we address this as an issue of discrimination, and I will come back to this later on. The problems that we had for the German case is that we do not have individual level data. For the Swiss case, we had over 200,000 individual cases where we could then see different aspects, with different features of the asylum seekers, whether this influenced then their chance to obtain protection or not, as to be accepted as refugees. And these individual level characteristics played a role. But within the German context, we did not get any kind of individual level data, which is necessary in order to study then discrimination and to prove it. So these problems continued. I tried to get access to the responsible German federal agency They did not want to provide data, so all these problems continued. I got in touch with professor of sociology at the University of Bamberg, who also works for a federal agency in Nuremberg. And with her and one of her students, we wrote an article based on the refugee survey. But this is then also only perceived discrimination. So a little bit frustrated, I turned to the Cluster of Excellence and submitted together with colleagues then a proposal with which we try to address then much more deeply than with aggregate data whether administrative discrimination exists in different policy domains. And you see here my collaborators and also the agencies that are funding this. So there is one research project on administrative inequality, very similar in the title to the one here, where we look at visa applications, where we look also at asylum, and then also at naturalization decisions, whether someone receives a German passport or not, and can keep his or her own passport at the same time. This isn't this one project, and then another project where we were commissioned to submit a proposal is within a large group of researchers across Germany, where we look at prejudices and stereotyping in the German job centers. So I will then present also some results here. And within this project, we get closest to proving the conditions under which there is active administrative discrimination at the individual level. So the project we conduct is together with Professor Christina Zuber. We also have here Professors Christian Bräunig and Daniel Thüm as PIs within these projects. Okay, so this is the structure of what I'm going to do during the next few minutes. I will first say something about the title of this study. Why can federalism be linked to discrimination, increased discrimination, both positive and negative discrimination? I will then give some indication on how this has changed across time and space in Europe and in Germany, and show this in the third step then with the different policy domains that we examined. And I will provide an explanation on why we have this, because in our research it is shown that the regional immigration mood is a key determinant of whether or not then the decision makers, these can be case workers, or then also judges in administrative courts, provide protection, support welfare benefit applications, or ease people through the naturalization process. And I will conclude then with some short recommendations on what could be done. Okay, so let's start out then with why federalism in this particular domain can be a bad way of how you structure a polity. So typically, the evaluations of federalism are very positive, because the larger territory is, the more heterogeneous this territory also is, and you need then federalist structure to balance this preference heterogeneity, because people in different parts might have different wishes with regard to education policy and so on. And with a federal structure, you can also create then incentives so that these regions can compete successfully against each other. For instance, with regard to the attraction of academics to particular universities or the attraction of firms to certain regions. So these are the positive aspects, but it has been for a long time been recognized that federalism can foster these spatial inequalities. And this has been recognized by one of the key figures in the study of federalism, a very important political scientist of the second half of the 20th century is William Riker. He wrote this influential monograph on federalism, where he then said, thus, if in the United States one disapproves of racism, one should disapprove of federalism, because the treatment, the discriminating treatment of Black people long continued after the Civil War in the South, and it still obviously continues in the United States, in states, in regions where there is a negative mood, where people have, or more people have racist preferences. Okay, so what is then administrative inequality or discriminations? I use both terms in this presentation. First, we have to say there is not only negative discrimination. Obviously, we are much more concerned in this context about negative discrimination. So people who are not protected, who do not receive welfare benefits, who are denied to have a second passport. These are all then cases of negative discriminations, but certain groups might also be privileged and have easier access than to benefits and also for the support of their specific claims. So how we started this up to now, largely within Germany, was in the aggregate. So we had figures only for the state level. But obviously, it can also, within one of the states, take, for instance, North Rhine-Westphalia with 15, 16 million inhabitants. You have across then such a state also spatial inequalities, because there are different treatments of foreign nationals in the different counties, as I will say later on. So discrimination is unequal treatment based on a kind of a marker, be it gender, ethnic origin, sexual orientation, or so on. This is the social science definition, and this differs from a legal definition, because in a court case, when someone claims that he or she is discriminated, then the burden of the proof for showing that this person really has a justified claim for being discriminated is much higher. So here you need to prove this at the individual level. Here we can find then discrimination in the aggregate between different groups, but to show that someone discriminates, you also would need data of the different people making this kind of decisions. And here we have major problems within Germany to get access to this data, something that I will discuss later on. So let's now look at how this decisions are made in the different contexts. First, I immediately turn to Germany, asylum decision making. So asylum is a policy where you have only the federal government and international law that sets the rule. So this means that people who decide decentralized fashion about asylum applications, they should evaluate similar claims in a similar way. So there is no discretion, there's no leeway for these decision makers. The federal office that is responsible for this is the Federal Office for Migration and Refugees, which has branch offices spread out all over the country. These are the blue dots here on the map of Germany. And asylum seekers whose application for protection or to become recognized as a refugee has been refused, they can appeal these decisions in one of the 48 administrative courts that deal with such claims. And it should be said that there are several 10,000 cases that are decided every year because about 80% of the refused asylum applicants, they appeal in these courts, and the courts make then the final decision. And the negative final decision means that this person has to leave Germany. Ultimately, this person could be deported, and you know from reading the newspaper, from listening to German news, what kind of discussion is currently going on in this domain within Germany. So sometimes we receive the reproach that we are only dealing with numbers, but obviously behind these numbers you have individual cases of people. I have taken just two cases we have looked at within one of the projects, also on the court decisions, made textual analysis, and I have picked out one positive decision in favor of the appealing asylum seeker. This person from Ramallah was refused on the an asylum application on the grounds that this person, a homosexual person, could also move to Tel Aviv. And then the responsible administrative court in Chemnitz got in touch with the federal foreign ministry in Berlin, and they obviously said that it's impossible for Palestinians from Ramallah to simply move to Tel Aviv and to find there a place where this person is not does not have to fear prosecution by homophobic people. The second case is then a negative one. So there was a Yazidi applicant before the Islamic State started to slaughter people from this ethnic group in Iraq and in Syria around 2014, 2015. This was denied, and this is important for these asylum claims. Asylum seekers have to show that they have an individual fear of persecution that is credible. And this could not be established according to this court here in Bremen at this particular point of time. We have also anecdotal evidence of discriminatory behavior of certain judges. One TV station, MDR, they made a report where they looked at the appeals for the Nigerian applicants, and they found then out there was only one judge that was responsible for this, that the chance to get an appeal approved for Nigerian applicants was much lower than it was at the federal level. And the discrepancy is so large that you could really speak of discrimination here. The judge in question has now been suspended from his job as a judge on this specific court because there's an ongoing investigation, because people believe that he wrote racist commentaries in the internet, which is obviously not the right qualification for a job who makes decisions in this particular case. And we find then in the aggregate that Gera is among the courts with the highest rejection rates all across Germany. As you see this on the slide on the left side, together with the administrative court in Bayreuth. And we also have then administrative courts which are more tolerant. Interestingly, the most tolerant administrative courts is also in the state of Thuringia, in one of the new states joining in 1991, Germany, the Federal Republic. There's certain differences why this is so, but it doesn't explain the full extent of the differences that you see here. What you also see then on the in the panel on the right side, that judgments or the whole procedures last, or the whole process is done much faster in Gera than in some other administrative courts in Germany. So you see this particularly here. So we also have then these differences in other dimensions. This is an earlier study based simply on comparison across the German states. So the first instance decision making varies over time. So you see here that 2010, more than 50% of the asylum applications were rejected by BAMF officials. This went then down in the beginning of the so-called refugee crisis and started to grow again when the immigration mood became more sore within Germany. The appeals that I just presented, also the aggregate figure for all over Germany changes over time. And interestingly, we almost do not have any good data on deportation because this data is not assembled. We were able, or one of my students was able at a certain point of time to get in touch with the federal police. They assembled this, but this has been abandoned. So when we hear discussions in the news about that more people should be deported, we do not really know what the empirical basis for all these claims is, because this data, which is important data for the political discourse, is not assembled in a systematic way. Okay, then the second domain that we examine and where we have interesting data are these spatial and temporal differences with regard to the so-called citizen benefits. This is the former unemployment benefit. It simply changed names. The condition changed slightly under the current, soon outgoing government. Another issue that is very much discussed nowadays. And we have here then 405 job centers that we have examined for their behavior with regard to sanctions towards recipients of these welfare benefits. And these job centers can be organized in different ways. They can be managed by the municipality, largely then the towns in which these job centers are situated, and then also in joint institutions between the federal agency and the municipality, which is the predominant mode of organization. What is now quite interesting when we look at job sanctions here, that we have these huge discrepancies. So we have then here two periods, 2007. So this was introduced, the citizen benefit under the Schröder government. And you see here that the sanction ratio is especially high in Bavaria, much lower in the east, for instance, in the Uckermark, and the county where Angela Merkel was for a long time then the direct candidate. So there are these differences here, and similar differences exist for the period from 2014 to 2020. And this is obviously something that needs explanation, and we are working on that. Also, huge differences in naturalization policy. You would believe that granting passports to foreign citizens is something that interests politicians. This is, however, largely an illusion, because a lot of this data is not assembled in a systematic way. So we do not then have good data on that. What is here is data on the dual citizenship. And you see here for three groups, Italian applicants for dual citizenship, Polish and Turkish applicants, that there are huge differences across the states. Obviously, especially with regard to Turkey, because Italy was already a member of the European Union, one of the founding members of the European Union, and Poland joined the European in 2004. And you see these differences then. All of these applications were successful. So EU citizens can keep the passport from the other EU country if they also want to have a German passport. This is not the case, or was not the case until June of last year with Turkish applicants. And here you see huge differences. So over the whole period of time, the denial for most of these applicants in Bavaria. Then there were changes over time for in North Rhine-Westphalia, but here the examination period then stopped in 2017 because they believed that it's not worthwhile to collect this data any longer. So what is then also interesting that within the very same state, we see these huge differences, sometimes in counties that are very comparable. So we picked out four counties in North Rhine-Westphalia, where you see here Hagen and Steinfurt with growing and quite high naturalization rates for dual citizenship, positive decisions, and then negative ones in the counties of Hamm-Stadt and Mönchengladbach. So this needs to be explained. And we approach this variance across time and especially across space through what is called in political science and economics a principal-agent approach. So typically you have a principal, which is the federal government, sometimes the state government, and then also the regional government or local government, might be the municipality, who decide on the specific policy. In asylum policymaking, you only have one principle, and the agents who make the decisions do not have any leeway. There is some leeway, obviously, for the citizen benefits and the naturalization, which explains some of these differences, but it should not explain what we suspect happens, that here the regional immigration mood, the political mood in general affects this decision-making. So what we put forward as a hypothesis, we examine whether here the informal principles, then these people in the surrounding of these case workers and judges who make the decisions, have an influence on the spirit of these people. So when you examine then discrimination, you have to distinguish the type of discrimination. Discrimination can simply be based on a racist preference, on negative attitude towards specific groups of people. I mentioned beforehand that there is some sort of marker which expresses this then. And we know, for instance, from asylum policy making that males, younger people, without single people have a lower chance to get accepted or receive protection, controlling for all the other possible factors. So this is an indication then of taste-based discrimination that manifests itself. Statistical discrimination is a second concept, which is simply discrimination due to a lack of information. When you do not really know sufficiently about the claim of an asylum seeker, for instance, then you easily stereotype your decision based on the experience that you had with people from the same kind of group. So, and what we also then examine, and I will come to this just in a minute, is then how the reporting by, by news agencies influences then this discriminatory behavior. So if there is, for instance, negative reporting about how specific groups of welfare recipients behave. So you see our theoretical framework in one of these studies down here, where we give then here in an experiment people a frame, a negative report. This leads then to specific attitudes, and this should intensify the discrimination. Obviously, there is already a baseline discrimination out there, which varies between individuals. Okay, so what influences this decision making besides all the legal factors? So at a certain point of time, there can be news which lead to positive attitudes or to negative attitudes. And there is an interesting article recently published by a French political scientist, Mathilde Emeriot, who is now at Sciences Po in Paris, who can show that the probability of a positive decision immediately after a shipwreck accident in the Mediterranean is higher, but it's negative in the days after a terrorist attack. So these are extra legal factors which obviously should not make a role, but asylum seekers have to, some asylum seekers have the good luck or the bad luck that that decision is just made at the wrong time. The second thing that we examine here is then the regional public mood. This is from the study that I already mentioned with Litvina Gundak and Julia Kozajakova, two sociologists. We looked at the refugee survey and examined then the probability that applicant has a positive decision, and we can show that some of the political factors in the states and or in the closer regions influence the chance to obtain protection within Germany. So this is, for instance, the case, as you see here. This is on the top. When you have an increasing share of residents who are very concerned about immigration to Germany, then the chance goes down that these individuals are then protected. When the state has introduced restrictive residence obligations, this also influences here the luck that applicants can have. And then also the share of non-monetary benefits to asylum seekers. So this regional policies, the regional mood is quite important in this particular domain. Okay, the second set of evidence comes from here then from the framing. So we conducted in job centers across the country among 1,400 caseworkers here a so-called survey experiment where we confronted them with different features that belong to a particular applications. And in the treatment, we confronted them with news about welfare fraud coming or associated with people from Romania and Bulgaria. And you see here the general effect here that there is slight effect here for Romanian female names, for the national treatment, for a national media outlet here. So this kind of discriminatory attitudes can get triggered by news. This gets then even stronger when we then also compare where the case workers are working, in which state. So whether or not this is in a state with a high level of anti-immigration mood, or whether they are to the left, they situate themselves to the political left or to the political right. So to the left on the panel, you have then here the differences according to whether or not they were living in a region, in a state with high level of anti-immigration mood. And you see here that people with Romanian nationality that got triggered by negative reports are treated differently than other asylum applicants. Something which you do not find in states where you have a low level of anti-immigration preferences. Similarly, then there's a difference whether one of these 1,400 surveyed job center employees, whether someone situates him or herself on the political right, then you see discrimination towards people with Romanian names, but also then for left-leaning employees, you see then a positive discrimination for people with Moroccan names. So this is evidence then based on a very large survey that we were able to conduct last year. Evidence, quite strong evidence that media reporting matters, political attitudes matter, and in summarizing, this regional mood plays an important role in the way how foreign nationals are treated in Germany and most likely beyond. So let me come then to the conclusion. As I said, we have this finding that there's a huge lottery, that the chance to get protected, the chance to receive welfare benefits and so on is similar to a lottery. It changes, your luck changes over time, and it matters on where you file an application or in which region you are forced then to live, where a decision on your application is made in case of asylum. So what would be needed? I mentioned several times that Germany is a data desert. We do not have sufficient information in many domains, especially in these high politicized areas. The authorities quite often claim that they need to protect the concerned people, but sometimes they only want to protect themselves. So during months, we had to get data in order to create a data file on the administrative courts. We had to write letters to the 16 ministries of justice across Germany, and we received then hundreds of Excel files that needed to be aggregated. So we have now the best data, but data that should obviously have been assembled beforehand by the Federal Ministry of Justice, not by us. Then it would be possible for citizens to really see what these discrepancies are, and then one could, with this transparency, one could find solutions to this. So the second thing is that these political factors, regional politics, shape administrative decision-making where it shouldn't have this particular influence. So what we need to reduce is the impact of politics here on these individual decisions. Negative decisions, quite often they destroy here also social welfare. In general, they are not only tragic for the people who are concerned. I mean, if this is an unjustified decision, so how can you improve this individual decision making or individual cases? So for controversial cases, demanding cases, you should introduce, make it mandatory that two people at least and two randomly selected people make these decisions. And you also need to send caseworkers and judges to anti-bias trainings, something that is required of us academics since quite some time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your talk. Do you think you can stop sharing your slide and we can see a full screen? Is that possible? And I encourage the audience to ask questions. Go ahead. Torun, start.
Yes. Thank you very much. This was really, really interesting for me. As I have a research project where we follow young adults who have been rejected in Sweden and who leave on so-called secondary migration, and they go to Germany and France and Italy, for instance, Belgium. But one of the findings, it's a qualitative ethnographic project, and one of the recurrent issues is that you should choose the right part of Germany and also the right part of France because of exactly what you're talking about. So there's actually this federalism that you're talking of explains a lot to me that, okay, so there's actually a sort of a structure here that sort of is known to people who flee again. Also, in Sweden, there have been studies of the same where they compare these administrative courts and find big differences between Malmö and Gothenburg and Stockholm that can only be described with, or mostly be analyzed as local cultures within the courts, within the administrative court, I think. But my question, so thank you very much. But my question is related to, you said a couple of times that in relation to asylum law, it leaves no leeway for the administrators or judges. And can you elaborate on that? Because I find the opposite, or maybe I'm misunderstanding, because the administrators, there's this credibility assessment that goes on in all the asylum cases. And if you have well, to be blunt, a racist attitude towards a group or a person, this will influence how you interpret their story. So, but you are talking about some other leeway.
I'm not sure. I might have misspoken for a certain minute, because in asylum, here, the officials at the first instance and then the judges at the second instance, they do not have any leeway. But the only basis that they can, the judgments, the decisions should only be based on the credibility of the claim that someone is has a fear of justified fear of persecution in the country of origin. But obviously, to establish this creates some gray zone.
Okay.
So what you have is some kind of what we call then leeway, informal, what is similar gray zone, so that in some cases the decision is positive, the other one is negative. What is then only surprising is the huge differences. I mean, you cannot prevent that not certain amount of mistakes are made in the system, but that these differences are systematic over time and across space, so that we have than certain chambers, like in Gera, that we have certain BAMF offices which are much more negative than other ones. And for this, you need more control from the political center.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, then I got it. Thanks.
Katarina, please.
Thank you, Charlotte. Hi, thank you very much for this very, very interesting talk. I just texted my colleague from Konstanz, Daniela, in the chat that I have to send your paper to my colleagues at the International Office of the University of Bayreuth, where I used to work, where we always had the feeling that the Ausländerbehörde was especially hard or harsh with us, or not with us, but with our students and researchers. And there also comes my question. You mostly spoke about asylum seekers, and I used to work, as I said, in Bayreuth with more, I'd say, privileged groups of people who looked for visas or citizenships, like students, researchers, etc. Do you also have data on these status groups, or did you focus mostly on asylum seekers? Or do you know if there is data that is split into the different status groups? That would be interesting to me. Thank you so much.
Unfortunately, we do not have data at the individual level. So what we now got, I applied for over a very long period of time to get access to data. I was even once invited to go to Nuremberg, where this federal office for migration and refugees is situated, but 2 days before the meeting should have taken place, they told me, okay, there will be no meeting. This was then one of the reasons, as I said in the beginning, of why I turned towards other ways of gathering data. Obviously, it would be necessary to have some sort of micro-census on a regular basis to examine then how the behavior in different administrative units in Germany takes place. I was part of this large group that studied racism in institutions across Germany. The project stopped by the end of December last year, so a few weeks ago. And there, quite some of the ministries or then also administrations, they did not want to have their employees studied systematically on their individual behavior. And it should be said that in other countries, access to data is much better. And this also leads then to better policy decisions. So in the Netherlands, for instance, they work closely together with researchers who then bring asylum seekers with good prospects to regions where they are needed for the regional or local labor market, something which in this very bureaucratic system in Germany does not exist. And a lot of these problems are simply based on the lack of information. And I'm really frustrated as a citizen that we do not know much about this, and that many of the politicians are not interested in data about these inequities that we notice across Germany, but also across other states.
Serena, go on.
Yeah, just to follow up, I also find it very interesting, and I just learned this today, that there is such a lack of data collection around this whole topic, especially as it is in the news and discussed by politics all the time. I also wonder what the correlation, or if there could be a correlation between the number of cases or let's say, the workload of the people working those cases and denial or acceptance rates, if there is some kind of correlation, because I also know that at least from my experience, the ones that I have contact with, these administrative offices are highly overworked here in Cologne as well.
Actually, this would be a typical hypothesis based on the notion of statistical discrimination that I've introduced. And actually, we examined this in this article that was published last year together with these two sociologists. And we actually found that an increased workload does not lead to more discrimination. So when you are in a region with a high level of attitudes against the negative attitudes towards foreigners, then irrespective of what the workload is, and to a considerable extent also irrespective on whether you have good or bad information about the country of origins of these refugees, this does not change. So this is an indication that there is some deep-rooted attitudes going on influencing the decision making. Obviously, since this is based on the refugee survey, we do not know whether this is the mood of the people making the decision or what they just believe that they should decide because this is how the people in their surroundings discuss this particular issue. But this is all stuff that should not happen. But here it's irrespective of what takes place. And we also find, for instance, there's a study by Judith Spierig from the University College of London. She also finds, with regard to Switzerland, that the decisions in asylum adjudication, decisions made by administrative courts, depend very much on the public mood, how positive it is in Switzerland. So this goes up and down, as it does in Germany, as it does in Sweden, as it does in France. And this influences then the likelihood that the judges make a positive or a negative decision.
More questions? If not, I have a question. You were talking about the different solutions to fix this, and you were mentioning 4 eyes strategy. I suppose that means that 2 different readers study the same case. And then you also talked about anti-bias training. So what I'm thinking is, well, a lot of studies have proven that anti-bias training is difficult to have effect. People don't like their bias changed. And I guess so that leaves us with a 4I solution. I'm thinking, I would like to ask, are there also other ways to get to this? I'm thinking, like, is there some form of monitoring of these decisions that are taking? Monitoring is a common way to also be a solution for bias, I'm thinking. Or what kind of possibilities are there to fix this? If we don't want Germany to be unitary.
I think these anti-bias trainings are important, although I have quite mixed feelings towards anti-bias trainings that I experienced myself. So as a panel member for the European Research Council, we were then exposed to always the same anti-bias training, which was actually based on a Swedish short movie, which was inappropriate for the kind of panel we were in. And this led then to many really negative reactions, especially about my female colleagues, because we then, in the end, we complained about this, but the ERC did not change its policy making based on our negative input. So same procedure as last year, which obviously is not the way you should go about in this context. Yes, monitoring is important, but monitoring should be done in a systematic fashion. That's why I mentioned beforehand that there should be occasional and unannounced surveys being conducted also at the individual level. I mean, in other countries, there are reports, because this is in the public domain, you get information about the behavior of individual judges. And so one of my brothers-in-law is just across the border, or should point in this direction, across the border in Switzerland, an administrative judge, and there is information assembled by him, published in the newspapers. So you know who are the guys who go towards positive discrimination or negative discrimination. So this is important. Monitoring is important, and this should be independent agencies who conduct this.
A follow-up question then. What does it, I'm thinking, if this is the case in Germany, and you also mentioned Switzerland, for example, is there also other areas that this regional differences could actually matters? I'm thinking now you're talking about migration, but I mean there are a lot of administrative decisions taking that affect people in general. Are there similar studies also in other areas?
There are also similar studies. I mean, I have a position in international politics, so I somehow have to justify why I'm looking at this kind of administrative decision making, and then the unequal treatment of foreign nationals is then something. So you can relate this somehow to international politics at the very micro level. But obviously, you have differences in sentencing. In different parts of the country. So the chance for a poor person who commits tax fraud, minimal tax fraud, to receive a maximum sentence is much lower than for a rich person. So there can be other kind of social differences that matter, regional differences, and so on. So this is something for the judicial system that should really be studied well. But this is especially a domain where data collection is something which is not very well developed, because you always hear then, okay, we make decisions on the individual case. The cases cannot be compared. But when you have thousands of cases, obviously you can compare them and then point out that there are problems. The problem then, the second problem is obviously that politicians are not really listening to what I'm preaching. Perhaps it's my problem, but I believe it's a general problem that this does not play a huge role also in electoral campaigns.
Okay, thank you so much. I think this was a very, very interesting session, and we all learned a lot. And as you said in the beginning, as a political science student, I always learned that federalism was a really good system. So this is quite it's a different point of looking at the federal system. But I think it's really important to acknowledge these differences and these biases that are built into our administrative systems. So thank you so much for a great lecture. And for everyone, if you want to see it again, we record it and we will put it on the website, of course. And I would also like just to shortly mention that we have a great series going on this spring, and have a look at our website and just Google, you could just Google Social Talks EUniWell, and then you will find our website and have a look at all the great talkers that are coming. So thank you so much, Gerald, and all the audience that came today.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Wonderful.
And I wish you all a good week. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.